Independent Speaking to the Blind, celebrating 40 years of audio newspaper production. Welcome to this week's edition of the National Podcast, recorded at the Bishop Briggs Media Centre by our amazing volunteers. You can get in touch with us via Facebook, Twitter or Instagram using @CuneReview, that is @ CUEANDREVIEW. You can also contact us directly by emailing information@cunereview.com, that is INFORMATION@CUEANDREVIEW.com, or by calling 0141 772 3976. That's 0141 772 3976.
This is from The National on Friday the 8th of September 2023, from the Politics section. Frankie Boyle joins in telling SNP to get off the fence over Rosebank. This article is written by Xander Eliards. Scots comic Frankie Boyle is among the campaigners urging Humza Yousaf to get off the fence and oppose plans for the Rosebank oil field in the North Sea. The news comes from an open letter from Friends of the Earth Scotland, which asks the SNP leader to put pressure on the UK government to halt plans for Rosebank, which is 80 miles off the coast of Shetland. Yousaf has previously said he is not convinced the development should go ahead, but his Energy Secretary and close ally Neil Gray has refused to vocally oppose it. Speaking to journalists in August, Gray said it was a decision for the UK government. Friends of the Earth Scotland said it received backing from hundreds of performers and visitors during the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in August, and its letter has been signed by Boyle, performer Julia Massley and actor Tam Dean Byrne. In the letter, Yousaf is told, "Until now you have avoided taking a strong position on the future of the oil and gas industry in Scotland, or on the development of the controversial Rosebank oil field. But the time for sitting on the fence is long past, and your silence on new fossil fuels is becoming a tacit approval for these projects." Plans for Rosebank, which contains up to 350 million barrels of oil and is currently one of the largest untapped discoveries in UK waters, is devolved to Westminster, but activists have said Yousaf's strong opposition could put pressure on UK ministers. Rosebank could produce 69,000 barrels of oil per day, about 8% of the UK's projected daily output between 2026 and 2030, and could also produce 44 million cubic feet of gas every day, according to Equinor, the Norwegian firm behind the project. Boyle's involvement follows his calls for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to throw out the Rosebank plans in February. In July, Sunak visited Scotland and announced plans to award more than 100 new oil and gas licences in order to max out reserves in the North Sea. Yousaf was confronted over his position by one of many hecklers during an appearance at the Edinburgh Fringe, which saw him respond, "I don't think Scotland's future is in oil and gas. I don't think it's the right thing to do to grant 100 new oil and gas licences in the month, I think he did it, that was said to be the hottest month in human history. Scotland's future is in renewables. Now we can't turn off the taps tomorrow. Oil and gas will be extracted for a period of time to come, because we have to make sure we take the workers of the North East with us." Friends of the Earth campaigner Freya Aitchison said, "People come to Edinburgh from all over the world to perform at and attend the Fringe, and from the outside it looks like Scotland is a green and forward-thinking place. From hundreds of conversations in the streets last month, it's clear that people are frustrated that in reality the Scottish Government doesn't always live up to this reputation. The Scottish Government needs to get off the fence and oppose the climate disaster that is Rosebank oil field. For too long they have been dodging the issue, and it is time the First Minister gave a clear answer to those asking whether he thinks the development should go ahead." Yousaf's predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon, previously voiced her opposition to the Cambo oil field being developed, but did not give a straight answer on support for Rosebank. That article was written by Xander Eliards. This is from The National on Friday the 8th of September 2023. From the news section. First Minister's questions. Number of Scottish schools impacted by rack concrete rises. This article is written by Abby Garton-Crosby. The number of Scottish schools impacted by rack concrete has risen to 40, the First Minister confirmed. In response to Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar, who asked when the Scottish Government first became aware of the issue, Humza Yousaf said they had been proactive in its approach. The First Minister also said that 9 out of 40 NHS buildings surveyed so far in Scotland have been found to have reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, RAC. The number of Scottish schools impacted has been growing, with a figure previously at 37 earlier in the week. RAC is less durable than concrete, as well as being cheaper to produce, and is prone to collapse when wet, with a life expectancy of little more than 30 years. It was used in the construction of various buildings between the 1950s and the mid-1990s. When the issue was raised at FMQs, Sarwar also called on the Scottish Government to publish a full list of schools impacted. The First Minister told MSPs that the Scottish Government had been aware of the issue of RAC for years. He said, "That's why, for example, we ensured that our education leaders had the appropriate guidance from the Institute of Structural Engineers. We have been proactive over that period, particularly the Education Secretary, in relation to her discussions with local authorities, to ensure that we have a full understanding of the picture. I can confirm that we have further information from local authorities that 40 schools have been identified that have RAC in them. Of course, the appropriate mitigations have been put in place." The First Minister added that the Scottish Government will work with local authorities to ensure that a full list of schools impacted will be published. In response, Sarwar said the issue went beyond schools. "We know that 255 NHS buildings across Scotland are being surveyed for suspected RAC," he added. "So, can I ask the First Minister when the survey will be completed and when we'll have a complete list of all public bodies affected?" Yousaf said that a major study on NHS buildings is very much underway to assess how many of the 255 buildings with characteristics consistent with the presence of RAC was well underway. 9 buildings have now been confirmed to contain RAC. That's from 40 buildings that have been surveyed, he said. He added, "We will work with partners, not just local authorities, but NHS boards and others, to see how much of that information can be put out publicly. I hope Anas Sarwar and others will appreciate that that will be an evolving picture as these surveys continue to progress." Elsewhere, Ross claimed that the First Minister wouldn't let the police pilot not to investigate some minor crimes go ahead in Glasgow. Yousaf hit back at the Scottish Tory leader's absolute nonsense claim and said he was trying to turn one community against another, adding that the pilot was an operational matter for Police Scotland. Ross also claimed that the Scottish Government is imposing funding cuts on Police Scotland, just days after a pay rise offer with the force was agreed. Yousaf told the Scottish Tory leader to correct the record, adding that the resource budget had been increased and any suggestion of a funding cut was simply untrue. Ross refused and said that the First Minister should correct the record, to which Yousaf said the Scottish Tory leader was chasing cheap political headlines. Referencing Ross's support of Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget, Yousaf said he had no credibility whatsoever on public finances in a fiery exchange. Meanwhile, the First Minister confirmed a public inquiry will go ahead into disgraced surgeon Professor Sam El-Jamel after an NHS Tayside report found concerns about him were not acted on with the urgency they deserved. And, in response to a question from Liam Kerr on the poverty-related attainment gap increasing, Yousaf said the Scottish Tory MSP could use his minuscule influence in his party to call for the 2-child limit to be scrapped or reverse a number of Westminster Tory policies to tackle poverty in Scotland. The First Minister jibed that Kerr should wipe away the crocodile tears, as reversing Tory measures would lift 30,000 children in Scotland out of poverty. That article was written by Abby Garton Crosby. This is from The National on Friday the 8th of September 2023, from the Politics section. Humza Yousaf popularity up since SNP leadership race, poll. This article is written by James Walker. The First Minister's popularity has risen since the SNP leadership race, according to a new poll. The polling conducted by Ipsos Scotland found that Humza Yousaf's favourability has improved from a net rating of -20 to -12 since March. The survey found that none of the Scottish or Westminster Party leaders included received a positive rating from the public. Scottish Labour leader Anna Sawa receives the least negative overall rating. 26% were favourable towards him and 34% unfavourable, as in -8 overall. While Humza Yousaf has a higher favourability rating at 31%, he also had a higher amount saying they were unfavourable at 43%, which brought his overall rating down. Douglas Ross and Rishi Sunak, meanwhile, received the most negative ratings, with net scores of -47 and -46 respectively. The polling also found that Scots were unimpressed by the Scottish Government's record on the economy, but also aren't convinced Labour would do better. Twice as many Scots think the Scottish Government is doing a bad job managing the economy as they say they're doing a good job, 50% versus 25%. However, just 29% say a Labour Scottish Government would do a better job on the economy. 23% say they would do worse, and 48% think it would make no difference or are unsure. To note, the Scottish Government doesn't have full control of the economy, with many powers reserved to the UK Government. As set out in the Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland (GERS) publication, less than 30% of revenue and 60% of expenditure is devolved to the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government also received a net negative rating across other policy areas, including being particularly negative about whether the Scottish Government is improving the NHS in Scotland. 55% they are doing a bad job of this, and 22% that they are doing a good job. This hasn't seemed to overly impact the party popularity scores, with the SNP receiving the highest score at -7. Again, all the main political parties in Scotland received net negative scores from the public. The Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party received the most negative rating, while Scottish Labour and the SNP are viewed less negatively. Emily Gray, Managing Director at Ipsos in Scotland, commented, Humza Yousaf's first programme for government places a strong emphasis on growing the economy, alongside tackling poverty and inequality and delivering on public services. These findings indicate the Scottish public see considerable room for improvement in the SNP government's performance across all these areas. Perceptions of their handling of the economy, in particular, are more negative now than they were when we last asked this in March. However, the public is not necessarily inclined to think of a Labour Scottish Government would do a better job. That article was written by James Walker. This is from The National on Friday the 8th of September 2023, from the news section. Scottish monuments sprayed with saltire leads to investigation. This article is written by James Walker. An old Second World War building near Edinburgh that has been sprayed with a saltire flag is to be investigated by Historic Environment Scotland. Pictures of the building, one of several built on Cramond Island in the Firth of Forth to fortify Edinburgh against submarine attacks during World War II, were shared on social media, with some expressing outrage and calling it vandalism. The saltire was depicted with a yellow heart at its centre. Historian Dr. Gordon Berkeley claimed it was a criminal offence in response to a post from anonymous unionist agitator Agent P, who claimed the eyesore can be seen from 2 miles away. Berkeley wrote, "A criminal offence under the terms of the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act 1979. The World War I and World War II defences are a nationally important scheduled monument." One of the few surviving World War II historic buildings on the island has been covered in paint. The eyesore can be seen from 2 miles away. Not everyone was in agreement, however. One ex-user wrote, "How is a saltire an eyesore to you? Politics aside, do you not like Scotland?" When approached, Historic Environment Scotland, HES, the lead public body established to investigate and care for Scotland's historic environment, told the National that they were investigating the incident. They said, "We have been notified about this incident and are now investigating." The assortment of buildings are a scheduled monument according to the HES website and are of national importance. The website reads, "This monument is of national importance because it is an integral part of the network of defences constructed in the First and Second World Wars to defend the Lothian coast and strategic interests in Forth. The diverse and well-preserved collection of First and Second World War structures on Cramond Island include unusual features such as the triple group of searchlight emplacements and a unique anti-shipping barrier. The island is part of the Dalmenia Estate, owned by the Rosebery Estates Partnership, who have been approached for comment. While Edinburgh City Council do not own the land, Scottish Labour councillor Val Walker, also the Culture and Communities convener, did comment, saying, "It is a shame to see vandalism anywhere in our city, but especially of a scheduled monument, as is the case of the war defences on Cramond Island. I hope that these defences can be restored properly, as they are an important part of our region's history." And that article was written by James Walker.
From the National, Monday the 11th of September, from the news section, Scottish Tories at odds with UK Home Office on drug consumption rooms. Report by Hamish Morrison. The Scottish Conservatives has found themselves at odds with the UK government over drug consumption rooms, with the party saying it was happy for the proposals to be tested. It puts them on the other side of the debate from the Home Office, which has repeatedly insisted there is no safe way to take illegal drugs and remains opposed to the plans. Scottish Tory leader Douglas Ross said he did not believe drug consumption rooms, where people can take illegal drugs in a safer environment without a fear of prosecution, were a silver bullet to fix Scotland's drug death crisis. But he added he was happy to see the proposals explored and said the Lord Advocate's announcement that she did not believe it was in the public interest to prosecute people using drugs in a pilot facility, expected to be launched in Glasgow, meant the SNP had now have no excuses not to take this action. In a statement, Ross said, "Today's statement from the Lord Advocate confirmed that the SNP government are able to proceed with a drugs consumption room pilot should they wish. We still have significant reservations about the effectiveness of consumption rooms, but the SNP now have no excuses not to take this action that they have been demanding for so long. Scotland has by far the highest drug death rate in Europe, and this national emergency has spiralled out of control under the SNP. The Scottish Governments are happy for a variety of potential solutions to be looked at, even though we don't think consumption rooms are the silver bullet ministers believe them to be. I would urge the SNP to back the Right to Recovery Bill, which focuses on treatment and rehab, and has the backing of experts in the field of addiction and those with lived experience." Responding to the Lord Advocate's announcement, the Home Office said, There is no safe way to take illegal drugs, which devastate lives, ruin families and damage communities, and we have no plans to consider this. We continue to share learnings from the Project Adder with the Scottish Government and exchange insights from initiatives aimed at addressing drug use. We welcome these ongoing discussions. It is understood that the Department considers the operation of a drug consumption facility inherently criminal and that Police Scotland's operational independence does not preclude it from enforcing UK-wide drug laws. And that report was by Hamish Morrison. From the National, Monday the 11th of September, from the news section, Sunak bows to pressure and raises case of Jagtar Singh Johal in India. An article first published on the 10th of September by Abby Garton Crosby. Rishi Sunak bowed to pressure and raised the case of detained Scot Jagtar Singh Johal with the Indian Prime Minister, but has been accused of talk and no action. The UK Prime Minister reportedly raised the detention of Johal, known as Jaggy, from Dumbarton, who was jailed after he was accused of helping to fund a Sikh on Hindu assassination plot in India following his wedding in 2017. Campaigners pointed out that previous UK Prime Ministers had raised Johal's case with the Indian authorities, but he remains imprisoned. The accusation is strongly denied by Johal and his family, who have been campaigning for his release. An investigation by the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention previously found there was no legal basis for Johal's imprisonment. The group cited multiple violations of the Scots human rights in a report and also claimed he was tortured into signing a false confession. More than 70 MPs demanded Sunak lobby for Johal's release on his first visit to India as UK Prime Minister. After speaking with his Indian counterpart, Narendra Modi, Sunak said he raised Johal's case along with other consular issues but did not provide details. The Foreign Office are continuing to provide support to Mr Johal's family and will continue to do so, he said. Johal, 36, was shopping with his wife in India when his family say he was snatched from the street by plainclothes officers from the Punjab police, where he was then beaten and tortured by officers for days. Indian authorities deny allegations of torture or that they forced Johal to sign a false confession and have repeatedly refused to release him. They accuse him of funding the purchase of weapons to assassinate a number of right-wing Hindu religious and political leaders in the Punjab. Johal is facing 8 years of conspiracy to murder, linked to political violence in India, and could receive the death penalty. He denies the charges against him and says his arrest and trial are political in nature. The UK government has previously refused to call for his immediate release, claiming it would not be in his best interest, as it would be seen as judicial interference. Asked if he would be raising the case in the flight to Delhi, Sunak said, I'll be raising a range of things with Prime Minister Modi. This is something that, just so people are reassured, has already been raised on multiple levels at multiple occasions. Johal's brother Gurpreet, who has been campaigning for his release, accused the Prime Minister of allowing him to rot in jail. I am pleased that the Prime Minister has raised my brother's case with his counterpart, but raising is not enough, unless he has called for Jagtar's release in line with the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention's findings, he said after being told Sunak raised his brother's case during the trip. Clearly, the Prime Minister had no option other than to raise Jagtar's case after so many MPs demanded he do so. I fear that this is just more talk from the UK government and no action. The campaign continues until Jagtar is back home in Scotland. Other campaigners calling for Johal's release have criticised Sunak's lack of leadership in the case. Theresa May raised Jagtar's case. So did Boris Johnson, but 6 years after his abduction and torture, he's still in prison, facing a possible death sentence for something he didn't do, Maya Foa, director of the human rights group Reprieve, said. The government often says ministers have raised the case 100 times. If that makes their failure to seek the release of an arbitrarily detained British national any less shameful. What did Rishi Sunak say to Narendra Modi about the case, and how did he respond? Without answers to these questions, the Prime Minister's talk is meaningless. Dabin Derjit Singh, the principal advisor to the Sikh Federation, said that the PM appeared very reluctant to raise the Scots case in his first year in Number 10, adding that it appeared he had been forced through pressure by MPs to do so. He has, however, demonstrated his weakness and lack of leadership by shamefully failing to stand up for the rights of a British citizen and calling for Jagtar's immediate release, he said. Rishi Sunak and his Foreign Office ministers are now talking utter nonsense in terms of Jagtar's best interests and justice. They appear scared and clueless in how to best apply diplomatic pressure on India and are leaving it to the corrupt Indian judicial system. We told how the Supreme Court of India granted bail in one of the cases against Johal last month, hailed as a major breakthrough by his family, and that report was by Abbey Garton Crosby. From the National, Monday the 11th of September, from the comment section, capitalist myth that hard work pays off is crumbling, by Steph Payton. When I was young, I once had a paper round. It wasn't much. I got maybe a few pounds a week from it, and what little money I did earn never really made up for the hassle of collecting newspapers from a local shop that seemed to set its opening hours on a total whim. From there, I worked in taxi dispatch, on call through the night to get people home despite being just out of high school myself. I've worked at an indoor mini golf, built inside a great windowless building that meant a long day shift during the winter would mean a day passing without the sight of sunlight. Work has been a constant presence in my life for as long as I can remember, and I say all this only to make it clear that I've always had what I'm sure would be described as a good work ethics. Like most other millennials, I was raised with the idea that hard work and an openness to learn would naturally lead to better things. And, like most other millennials, the past 2 decades has taught me that this was all utter bullshit. New research has revealed that people in the UK are now amongst the most likely to view work as something that should not be their main priority in life. Increasingly, the belief that hard work leads to success and reward is becoming a far less mainstream. But it's in digging into the generational data that the real story lies. For boomers and the pre-war generation, it still appears to be the majority position that placing less importance on work wouldn't be a bad thing. But for millennials, the opposite is true. In 2009, 41% of millennials felt that work should come first. By 2022, this had fallen to just 14%. It should be clear why. 2 decades of life experience has shown us that hard work means almost nothing in terms of career progression now. The concept of a job for life is as alien to us as the prospect of home ownership without external help. Margaret Thatcher may have kick-started the fastest growth of wealth and inequality in British history, but it is the austerity programmes that followed under successive Conservative governments that have been key to continuing the trend of funneling more and more wealth out of the hands of the working class and up to the 1%. With advancing technology and global business always in the hunt for new means of drastically cutting workforces for the benefit of their bottom line, there is a constant, unsettling sense of a job market getting smaller and smaller with no job safe from redundancy. All of which is to say that, for the past 20 years, the millennium workforce has lived under the worst excesses of capitalism. How could this endless need for growth lead us to any other conclusion than this, that we are being duped, that those late nights and long hours benefit no one but the bosses? What even is a career now? It's certainly not the opportunity to advance through the ranks of a company on merit as it once was. Now, it's flitting between jobs and workplaces in the hope that the next one will pay a little more, be a little more secure, will have something better to offer, better than a 0 hours contract and a sign politely reminding the public not to abuse the staff. Or, better yet, why not just work for free? How about an unpaid internship to get your foot in the door? At least that acknowledges from the get-go that the moment you step into that workplace, you'll be exploited and undervalued. But at least it's going to look great on your CV. We were not prepared for the various indignities of the modern workplace. The estrangement from the self that Karl Marx described in the early 1900s, where we as individuals are reduced to non-autonomous economic entities in service to the goals of the bourgeois. I don't believe it to be any coincidence that the rise in excessive and deliberate wealth inequality runs parallel to the decline of the trade unions, a trend that finally feels to be reversing. But what victories there have been for the labour movement are not enough to inadvertently mask the gross and excessive extraction of wealth that strips national infrastructure, while bills spiral higher and companies post record profits that will never reach the hands of those who made them. The myth of hard work is crumbling faster than an English primary school. Truly, how deeply we must have drunk of the capitalist Kool-Aid to have ever entertained the notion that our lives and loves, the things that make this brief time we have worthwhile, should have ever come second to work in service of the rich. And that was a comment piece by Steph Payton. From the National, Monday the 11th of September. From the Culture section, East Kilbride £100 million redevelopment plan revealed. By National News Desk. More than 75 years after East Kilbride welcomes its first residents, a radical master plan to redevelop its rundown centre has been unveiled. The Herald reports that more than a third of the existing shopping centre will be demolished, with retail reduced by 42% to make way for hundreds of new homes, a hotel, shops and a civic space in a project sector insiders estimate could top £100 million. I would like to think it would restore some civic pride, says Mark Hewitt, Director of Scoop Asset Management, which was brought in to come up with a plan to rejuvenate the town after centre owner Sapphire went into administration last year. Clearly, I'm not local, said the London-based project leader, and maybe because of that, I've done a bit more homework than I might have otherwise have done in terms of looking into the history of the town. It's been quite interesting looking at the old news clips to see how passionate and proud people were of the town centre in those first 20 to 30 years of the new town. Walking around it today is quite difficult to identify that same passion, he said. The original part of the town centre redevelopment opened in 1959, with Prince's Square followed in 1962, and the plaza starting in 1971. The refurbishment of Prince's Mall and Prince's Square followed. The shopping centre covers around 1.40 million square feet, which, at its time, was the largest in Europe, with more than 150 shops, restaurants, a cinema and an ice rink. The vast majority of that space is retail, and it currently has around 75 vacant units. Like others, through the pandemic, it lost a number of large tenants such as Debenhams. East Kilbride for many years performed a sub-regional function in that it drew in on a much wider catchment than its immediate population, said Hewitt. As time went on and Glasgow strengthened with Braehead and then Silverburn, its ability to compete at that sub-regional level has got less and less. 20 years ago, when Silverburn was being proposed, the answer from East Kilbride was, well, let's build more space and make itself an even bigger shopping centre to take on that competition, which is entirely understandable at the time, but of course, with the benefit of hindsight, all that has done is exacerbate the problem. We are redefining East Kilbride's function as a town, added Hewitt. It needs to refocus to serve its own population first and foremost. Effectively, the shopping centre here is a town centre. It covers such a large expanse. At the heart of the private and public funded development will be new 40,000 square feet supermarket at Olympia Mall entrance. A budget hotel will replace the ageing entrance area near the bus station at Prince's Mall, and operators have already been secured for both. Centre West will be demolished to create a new neighbourhood of up to 400 homes in the heart of the town in an open green format. The ice rink, Pure Gym and Odeon Cinema will remain, while the area between the plaza and the Olympia will be redeveloped as a new civic square, with the public asked to decide what they would like it to be used for. The master plan has a number of green aspirations, including making cars less dominant and delivering more space and access points for pedestrians and public transport connections. A public consultation will get underway today, lasting until the end of the month. Project leaders said there is an ability to push ahead fairly quickly with planning applications for individuals, elements of the project. It's time to be radical, said Hewitt. If you've got a nicer place to shop in a more balanced town centre, then some of those people who are going to Silverburn might be attracted to start shopping local again. With that comes more jobs and more gross value added, GVA, and so on. I'm not saying this is going to fix all the woes of the world, but I think if people can see that someone is taking an interest, they have a vision, and things start to happen sooner rather than later, all of that ought to start building confidence. The master plan will generate employment through short-term construction jobs and longer-term regeneration through town centre employment in retail and leisure, business rates, as well as more local spend. Anthony Hubbard of 360 Architects said, "We need to transform the shopping centre from an island in the middle of East Kilbride into the heart of the town by creating a permeable, safe and accessible environment." Scoop AM has also been involved in the redevelopment of Eastgate Shopping Centre in Inverness and Stirling's Thistle Centre. The East Kilbride project mirrors plans for St Enoch Centre and Buchanan Galleries in Glasgow, which are to be demolished over the next 10 years to create more homes in the city centre and reduce the dominance of retail. And that report was by the National News Desk. From the National, Monday the 11th of September, from the Culture section. Mobile cinema which travels Scottish Islands at risk of closure. Report by James Walker. Scotland's mobile cinema is at risk of closing after serving rural communities for nearly 25 years. The 80-seat Screen Machine tours the Highlands and Islands, Argyll and Bute and North Ayrshire, but has been out of service due to breakdowns. While Regional Screening Scotland, RSS, which operates the service, has leased a replacement until April next year, there is no funding in place beyond then. Posting on Facebook, RSS said a new mobile cinema would cost at least £1.4 million and take up to 18 months to build. They also called on the Scottish Government to intervene. They wrote, "Next month will mark the 25th anniversary of the Screen Machine service and, whilst this is a cause for celebration, there is reason for concern. Our lease of Cinemobile will expire in April 2024 and, without investment for a brand new greener mobile cinema, the Screen Machine service will be wound down. We need the Scottish Government to provide 50% of the approximate £1.4 million for a new cinema. This will allow us to begin construction as we fundraise the rest of the balance. We need you to write to MSPs to let them know you care about the future of the Screen Machine service. We understand that this may come as a shock to some of you, but we believe that with the voices of our communities behind us, we will be able to build a new cinema and continue to bring films to all of you for many more years." Fiona Fowler of Region Screen Scotland also told the BBC that some were already missing out because the leased vehicle could not be transported to 7 islands, including Cumbria and Jura. She says she worries about the future of the service, adding, "With nothing in the pipeline, we will be forced into winding the service down." A Scottish Government spokesman said, "The Scottish Government values the importance of our cultural organisations and their contribution to the well-being of the country to promote the arts, provide employment and engage with communities across Scotland." And that report was by James Walker.
The National News on Wednesday, the 13th of September. 600 suspected drug deaths in 6 months. An article written by Jane MacLeod. Suspected drug deaths in Scotland rose in the first 6 months of the year, new figures show. Statistics published by the Scottish Government showed that there were 600 fatalities over the period January to June. That's up 7% on the same period in 2022. Separate statistics published last month by the National Records of Scotland showed a fall in deaths from drugs misuse, with these dropping to 1,051 in 2022. That's down by 279 on the 2021 figure. That was the largest ever fall recorded, but yesterday's figures showed 38 more suspected drugs deaths in the first 6 months of this year compared to January to June 2022. A total of 302 suspected drugs deaths were recorded in April to June 2023, 4 more than the first 3 months of the year. The latest quarterly total was, however, 9% higher than in April to June 2022. Almost 3/4 of those who died between January and June were men, with this up from 69% in 2022, and just over 2/3 of fatalities involved people aged between 35 and 54. This was said to be broadly in line with previous statistics. There were 26 suspected drug deaths among the under 25 age group, with this down by 16% from the first 6 months of 2022. The data, based on operational information from Police Scotland, showed the force's divisions with the largest number of suspected drugs deaths were Greater Glasgow with 143, followed by Lanarkshire with 76 and Edinburgh City with 73. The figures were released the day after Scotland's top law officer, Lord Advocate Dorothy Bain, paved the way for a safer drugs consumption room to be piloted in Glasgow, saying it would not be in the public interest to prosecute people using such a facility for possession of illegal drugs. Drugs Policy Minister Elena Whittam said the new statistics showed there was no room for complacency. Ms Whittam said, while the official statistics from National Records of Scotland for 2022 showed a decline in the number of deaths in 2022, a reduction of 279 from the previous year, the numbers we're seeing remain far too high. The suspected drug death figures for the first half of this year show there is absolutely no room for complacency as we continue to deliver our national mission to tackle this crisis. This includes implementation of the key harm reduction approaches such as safer drug consumption facilities, following the announcement by the Lord Advocate. It's vital this pilot has the full confidence of the general public, as well as those who use the facility, and the leadership of Glasgow and Police Scotland will help ensure it's introduced as quickly as possible. Through our £250 million national mission, we're doing everything within our powers to tackle drug deaths in Scotland. With the number of deaths at the levels we're seeing, we're determined to use every means at our disposal as we face future challenges, including the increasing threat from synthetic opioids. An article written by Jane MacLeod. The National News on Wednesday, the 13th of September. Campaigner sues Met Chief over coronation arrest. An article written by Laura Pollock. The head of an anti-monarchy movement is set to sue Metropolitan Police Chief Sir Mark Rowley in what has been described as the first test case of new anti-protest legislation. Graham Smith was arrested at a protest in London on the day of the coronation in May, along with 7 campaigners for the group Republic, which had liaised with the Met to organise a Coronation Day protest in Trafalgar Square. They were arrested on suspicion of going equipped to lock on, but were released 16 hours later without charge. Following the arrests, Mr Rowley insisted police had serious and reliable intelligence that protesters planned to disrupt the coronation by using rape alarms or loudhailers during the coronation procession. Later, the police expressed regret for arresting the group and said it was not clear at the time to the arresting officers that at least one of the group stopped had been engaging with police about holding a lawful protest prior to the coronation. We regret that those 6 people arrested were unable to join the wider group of protesters in Trafalgar Square and on the procession route. Mr. Smith's lawyers have said the case will be the first time that a court has had the chance to consider the correct approach when it comes to the Public Order Act, which gives police in England sweeping powers to crack down on peaceful protest. Mr. Smith said, "The important thing is that we need answers as to where the law stands on the right to protest, and there's a matter of natural justice for those of us involved. I, for one, would certainly like to hear a full-throated apology from the Met Police." It's claimed by Mr. Smith's lawyers that officers who arrested him did not have reasonable grounds to suspect an offence would be committed because of his extensive communication and cooperation with the defendant's officers in respect of the protest. In a 39-page statement of facts, it states, Mr. Smith informed the defendant's officers of the details as to where and when the protest would be carried out, how many people would attend the protest, and that Republic would be bringing a large number of placards for use by attendees. The defendant's officers did not raise any objection to this planned protest. In a formal response, the Met Police has called for the High Court to reject Mr. Smith's request for a judicial review. It argues that the threshold for an arrest is a low one and defends the arresting officer by saying he had reasonable grounds to arrest Mr. Smith. A Scotland Yard spokesperson said, "We can confirm that a judicial claim has been issued. It would be inappropriate to comment on ongoing proceedings." An article written by Laura Pollock. The National Politics on Wednesday the 13th of September. Catalan independent supporters fill Barcelona streets. An article written by Hamish Morrison. Thousands of Catalan independent supporters filled the streets of Barcelona to put pressure on Spain's embattled Prime Minister to accept their demands. According to the city's municipal police force, Guardia Urbana, some 115,000 people showed up to a rally on Monday, though organisers said the figures were much higher at 800,000, reports El Nacional. The demonstration was organised by the Asamblea Nacional Catalana, which hopes to pile pressure on Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez to accede to pro-Catalan Independence Party's demands. They want the Socialist Party leader to promise amnesty for exiled politician Carles Puigdemont, who fled to Brussels after holding a wildcat referendum which triggered a fierce response from the Spanish government. 9 of those involved have since been pardoned, though Senor Puigdemont and his supporters still wish to see the authorities promise he will remain a free man if he returns to Spain. Catalan nationalists also want the Prime Minister to get the EU to adopt Catalan as one of its official languages and say they will block him from forming a government if he fails. Catalan nationalists were made kingmakers after an election earlier this year produced inconclusive results. Senor Sánchez could yet hold on to power with the backing of the 2 main Catalan nationalist parties, while the centre and far right remain effectively locked out of power because they have refused concessions to separatist parties. The clock is ticking for the Prime Minister to gain the full backing of the smaller parties, or he could be forced to call another election. El Nacional described the demonstration held on Catalonia's National Day as placid and said all major pro-independence civil society bodies signed a pact for the movement. An article written by Hamish Morrison. The National News on Wednesday the 13th of September. Glencoe search finds missing hill walker's backpack. An article written by Laura Pollock. A backpack belonging to a missing hill walker has been found in a search for the man who disappeared in Glencoe 5 days ago. Charles Kelly left his home in Tillicoultry last Wednesday for a hike in the Glencoe area and last contacted his family at around 8 p.m. on Thursday, according to Police Scotland. Glencoe Mountain Rescue Team, RAF officers, police mountain rescue teams, a Coast Guard search and rescue helicopter have all been launched to assist in a search, but confirmed Mr. Kelly has not been traced, apart from his rucksack. Brian Bathurst, deputy leader of the rescue team, said Mr. Kelly's rucksack had been found on Saturday on Ben Vichaskeig. He said, It must have fallen about 350 metres, as it's very steep there, but there was no sign of Mr. Kelly. The water bottles were empty, and as it's been very hot recently, he may not have water and could be disorientated. We've been over the ground with a fine tooth comb, we've used drones, search dogs and a helicopter, and we can find no other trace of him. The only other thing we can think of is that he may have retraced his steps. Where he dropped his rucksack is on really steep ground. He parked his car at the Glencoe Ski Centre and was positively identified by staff there. We don't believe that he's that experienced a hill walker, and he's normally accompanied on his walks. He messaged his wife on Thursday, I believe, to say that he was okay, but that he was lost. We will search again today, and we will not give up hope yet. We're all hoping for a positive outcome, but it's a bit baffling at the moment where he is. The public is asked to contact Police Scotland if they have any information by calling 101 and quoting incident 4788 of September 7th. An article written by Laura Pollock. The National News on Wednesday, the 13th of September. The National Union of Journalists blasts the BBC over its editorial approach. An article written by Steph Braun. A journalist union has demanded an explanation from the BBC after the corporation removed a presenter's criticism of deeply unpopular local radio cuts. BBC Radio Norfolk presenter Sophie Little made headlines this week after she used the last episode of her cancelled show to brand the organisation ableist and ageist. The National Union of Journalists has now expressed concern about the BBC's editorial approach after it censored her 2-minute speech in the BBC Sounds version of the programme. Bosses have written to the organisation seeking answers, with many members said to be alarmed by its actions. The union has also requested an equality impact assessment is carried out into the cuts, with local radio staff now formally facing redundancy across England. The organisation is particularly worried about the number of disabled, black and women members of staff being served notice of redundancy. The BBC, which is cutting and merging shows throughout the week on local stations, admitted it had not undertaken an equality impact assessment of local radio cuts on audiences, many of whom are elderly, disabled, not online or hard to reach. Shows across 39 stations are disappearing altogether, with long-standing presenters, journalists and producers losing their jobs. Smaller numbers of newsreaders will be forced to pre-record bulletins that are set to be shared across the stations. Paul Seagert, NUJ broadcast organiser, said, "These plans remain deeply unpopular among staff, audiences, politicians and communities across the country. We want to retain as much local programming as possible, and we absolutely want to see news kept live and local. Pre-recording 20 minutes before means news bulletins will miss any breaking stories and seriously undermine the quality of BBC local news." The NUJ is very concerned about the number of disabled, black and women members of staff being served notice of redundancy. By its own admission, the BBC needs to do better on diversity of staff, particularly when it comes to disabled staff, yet we're seeing little consideration given to members with disabilities facing distressing and complicated redeployment and redundancy situations. The impact on minority and vulnerable audiences is also considerable, prompting many charities speaking out across the country. Ms Little's criticism came days after pre-legal action was launched by a charity working for blind and visually impaired people, which believes the BBC is acting in breach of the Equality Act. Lawyers for blind radio listener Sarah Ledbetter have written to Director General Tim Davey. Back in June, Mr Davey was quizzed by MPs on BBC staff demographics and in response to a question about the BBC pay gap increasing in all areas. He acknowledged the figures and said disability was an area we need more people in senior roles, and that's a challenge. The BBC has been approached for comment. An article written by Steph Braun. The National News on Wednesday, the 13th of September. Pensioners set for bumper payments amid rising wages. An article written by Hamish Morrison. Retirees look set for a bumper state pension increase next April, amid concern that the UK government is struggling to maintain the gold standard triple lock. Earnings figures released by the Office for National Statistics on Tuesday indicated that the state pension could leap by 8.5% next April. This could take the average weekly new state pension from £203.85 to £221.20, or from around £10,600.20 to £11,502.40 on an annual basis. The basic state pension could rise from around £156.20 to £169.50 per week, or from £8,122.40 to £8,814 annually. The Department for Work and Pensions said on Tuesday that the government is committed to the triple lock and, as usual, a statutory annual review of benefits and state pensions will take place in the autumn. But speculation is growing that the government may struggle to afford the gold standard annual increase in the coming years, with the pensions budget set to put billions of pounds worth of extra pressure on public finances. Under the triple lock, the state pension tends to rise each year in line with earnings, price rises, or 2.5%, whichever is the highest. As well as being higher than 2.5%, the earnings measures is also expected to be higher than September's Consumer Prices Index inflation measure, which is the other element of the triple lock. The Institute for Fiscal Studies recently said an additional £11 billion per year is spent on state pensions as a result of the triple lock, compared with what spending would have been if growth had been in line with either prices or earnings. The triple lock was introduced by the Conservative-led coalition government in 2010 as a way of ensuring pensioner income did not lose value in real terms. It's been seen as an important offer to older voters. Steve Webb, a former pensions minister who is now a partner at Lane Clark and Peacock, said, "Today's figures for earnings growth are likely to mean a second successive significant cash increase in the value of the state pension, following on from this year's 10.1% increase. Alongside a continued freeze of the tax-free personal allowance, this is likely to drag well over 500,000 more pensioners into the income tax net. Once again, stealth taxation proves a convenient revenue raiser for the Chancellor. In terms of the triple lock policy, with a general election in the offing, it seems quite inconceivable that the government would choose to break the triple lock promise for a second time in 3 years. Such a decision would be like aiming a laser-guided missile at the core of Conservative support and could fatally undermine the party's electoral prospects." With the personal tax threshold due to be frozen again at £12,570 next year, a large pension rise coming on top of last year's 10.1% rise could drag many more pensioners into paying income tax. Between 2022-2023 and 2023-2024, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs figures suggest that the number of those aged 65 plus who pay income tax rose by roughly 750,000, from 7.73 million to 8.5 million, off the back of the April 2023 state pension increase, according to Lane Clark and Peacock. Jason Hollands, managing director at wealth management firm Evelyn Partners, said, "Anyone with even a very modest private income will be tipped into paying basic rate tax at 20%, with some estimates expecting 500,000 more pensioners to become taxpayers in the next tax year." While pension saving can still be very tax advantageous, particularly if a saver is a higher or additional rate taxpayer in their working life, but then a basic rate payer when they draw on their pension, this does serve to remind today's savers of the value of ISAs, which can provide a valuable supplementary income to pensions during retirement, which is not taxed at access, although contributions to ISAs for most people will be made from taxed income. A Department for Work and Pensions spokesman said on Tuesday the government is committed to the triple lock. As is the usual process, the Secretary of State will conduct his statutory annual review of benefits and state pensions in the autumn, using the most recent data available. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak recently declined to say if the policy will feature in his party's manifesto at the next general election, due by January 2025. Speaking to reporters during his trip to the G20 summit in India, Mr Sunak said, "We're not going to speculate on the election manifesto now. I've got plenty to get on with between now and then. But the triple lock is the government's policy and has been for a long time." An article written by Hamish Morrison. The National Politics on Wednesday the 13th of September. Call to take throwaway vapes off open display. An article written by Laura Pollock. The Scottish Government is being urged to remove vaping products from open display in stores amid concerns that children as young as 8 are becoming hooked on them. Green MSP Gillian Mackay pressed the government for action as she said large-scale nicotine cessation may be needed for children and young people addicted to vaping. She made the plea as she told Public Health Minister Jenny Minto she had heard of children as young as 8 using vapes who may need support. Ms Minto accepted that it was a very difficult situation we're in, pledging the use of vapes would be considered in this autumn's Tobacco Action Plan. While the Scottish Government has also committed to carry out a consultation on a possible ban on the sale of single-use vapes, Ms Mackay stressed that harm is still occurring while this work is being carried out. Raising the issue with ministers at a meeting of Holyrood's Health Committee, the Scottish Green MSP said, "Many of these products are being displayed in windows and alongside suites on the end of aisles, in full view of children and young people." Calling on the Scottish Government to move quickly to put these products out of sight, particularly out of the sight of children, Ms Mackay raised concerns about the pervasiveness of these products. She said, "They can be reached by toddlers on ends of aisles in some shops. If that was cigarettes, we would rightly be outraged. It's the same addictive ingredient that's in these products too, so is there consideration to putting them behind covers?" Ms Mackay went on to raise concerns about the addiction children are currently suffering and the potential long-term health impacts. She said, "We've never needed large-scale nicotine cessation for children before, but that is potentially looming, and many of the nicotine replacement therapies we currently have are only licensed for children aged 12 and over, and we have anecdotally heard of children as young as 8 using vapes who may need support." Scottish Conservative health spokesperson Sandesh Gulhane said he also had a huge concern about the number of kids who are vaping. He said youngsters use such products openly, saying, "It's not behind the bike sheds having a cigarette, but it's walking down the street. It's in schools." Dr Gulhane, who is a GP as well as an MSP, went on to tell the committee that youngsters would vape in school toilets and then hide the vapes in the lights. Pressing the minister for action, he said, "When will we hear about things we can put into place concretely to stop under-18s from buying vapes? It's illegal already, but trading standards can't cope, so we need something to be done here." Ms Minto told the committee it's a hugely worrying situation we're seeing, saying there were a number of strands of work within this area where the Scottish Government was involved. The minister said there was ongoing work following a consultation on the restrictions on advertising and promotion of vapes. Ms Minto added, "We've got the Tobacco Action Plan, which will be coming out in the autumn of this year, and it absolutely is looking at vapes and where they are in shops. It will be covered in the Tobacco Action Plan." Meanwhile, she said there were no nicotine replacement products currently licensed for children under 12, but said this was something we are looking into. An article written by Laura Pollock. The National News on Wednesday the 13th of September. Scottish firefighters join quake rescue team. An article written by Lucy Garcia. 2 firefighters and a search and rescue dog from the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service has joined an international team as part of the UK government's response to the Morocco earthquake. K9 handler crew commander Gary Carroll and Curry, based at Portlethen, have departed along with watch commander Gavin Brown, based in Dundee, as part of the UK International Search and Rescue Team, deployed to Morocco through the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. The UK has scrambled a team of 62 search and rescue specialists, 4 search dogs and rescue equipment, as well as a medical assessment team. It's Kouri's first deployment since the 2-year-old Malinois Belgian Shepherd graduated earlier this year from a training and assessment course. Scottish Fire and Rescue Service Deputy Assistant Chief Officer Bruce Farquharson is the UK International Search and Rescue Team Manager in Scotland. He said, "Our thoughts are with all those affected by the devastating earthquake in Morocco, and upon arrival there, our team will be ready to join the wider effort to help as many people as they can with their specialist skills." Foreign Secretary James Cleverly said, "The UK government has sent immediate support to Morocco, including a team of 62 search and rescue specialists and 4 rescue dogs to assist with the rescue effort. I remain in contact with Foreign Minister Bourita and offer my deepest sympathies to the people of Morocco after this tragic event." It's the second time in 2023 that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service has deployed firefighters to a disaster zone. In February, Watch Commander John Aitchison, Crew Commander Stephen Adams, and firefighters Tony Armstrong and Keith Gold were part of the operation in Turkey. An article written by Lucy Garcia.
From the National, Thursday the 14th of September, from the news section, census results show Scotland has record high population. Report by Abby Gartland-Crosby. Scotland's population was estimated to be 5,436,600 on census day, hitting a record high according to newly released data. The National Records of Scotland, NRS, said the figures, collected on March the 20th, 2022, paint a fascinating picture of how Scotland and our communities are changing. The population increase of 2.7% was largely driven by migration, the results revealed, and would have shrunk otherwise. This is the largest population ever recorded by Scotland's census, and is part of the first set of statistics from last year's census. The data showed that the population of Scotland grew by 141,200, 2.7%, since the previous census in 2011. This is a slower rate of growth than between 2001 and 2011, when the population grew by 233,400, 4.6%. Without migration, the population of Scotland would have decreased by around 49,800 since 2011. It comes as a survey found that 2/3 of Scots feel that immigration is a good thing for the country. Elsewhere, the population increased by 6.3% in England and Wales, and by 5.1% in Northern Ireland between 2011 and 2021. The Scottish Government pledged to address depopulation and social isolation after the findings. Angus Robertson, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, said the low birth rate showed the consequences of Brexit. The data also highlights Scotland's ageing population, with more than 1 million people aged 65 and over, a total of 1,091,000. It also showed that the number of people in older age groups, over 65, increased by 22% since 2011. It is also over 250,000 higher than the number of people under 15, 832,300. Comparatively, results from the 1971 census showed there were twice as many people under 15 than 65 and over. In 2011, the two age groups were of a broadly similar size. Across Scotland, the population increased in 17 council areas between 2011 and 2022, and most of the central belt saw increases, especially around Edinburgh, driven by migration from within Scotland and elsewhere. Next year's results will be published in ethnicity, religion, the labour market, education and housing. For the first time, it will include data on veterans, sexual orientation and trans status or history. Janet Egdell, NRS Chief Executive, said, "This is an exciting milestone for Scotland's census, and the results paint a fascinating picture of how Scotland and our communities are changing. census data is vital for planning health services, education and transport, and the information published through our results will help local and central government, businesses and charities to shape Scotland for years to come. Robertson said the figures represent a historic moment. It also confirms this growth has been driven by inward migration, demonstrating that Scotland is an attractive place to come to live and work, he added. However, we know Scotland faces an ongoing population challenge with fewer births than deaths registered since 2011, which reinforces how damaging Brexit continues to be with the loss of freedom of movement. The census also shows that our population is ageing. Understanding these changes in the population will allow local authorities and the government to adapt vital public services to better meet the needs of those living and working in Scotland, including our large, established migrant community whose contribution we greatly welcome. The Constitution Secretary said that, as outlined in the Programme for Government, Ministers will publish a depopulation action plan to tackle population decline in some of Scotland's communities. We will also introduce a talent attraction and migration service to support more people to live and work here, he added. We have also called on the UK Government to devolve immigration powers to the Scottish Parliament and work with us to deliver our proposal for a rural visa pilot to enable rural and island communities to attract migrants in line with local needs. The census also shows a trend towards smaller households and more households overall, which further demonstrates the importance of our strategy to tackle social isolation and loneliness through stronger social connections, and our continued funding for organisations working to address this issue. Scottish Tory MSP Donald Cameron, Shadow Constitution Secretary, accused Robertson of being too complacent by claiming that population rise shows Scotland is an attractive place to live and work. The fact is that the increase in Scotland's population is less than half the rate seen in the rest of the UK compared to the last census, he said. It's vital we attract more people to Scotland to staff our under-resourced NHS and boost economic growth, but the SNP's obsession with higher taxation and their failures in public services are all bad signs for future provision, particularly in the context of our ageing population. The SNP botched administration of this census by needlessly separating it from the UK one, and, as a result, it was late and produced a much smaller return, to the extent they had to bring in an international steering group to check the results. They must not take the same negligent approach to interpreting the results. And that article was by Abby Garton-Crosby. From the National, Thursday the 14th of September, from the politics section, First Minister's questions, MSP stunned as Tory blames SNP for UK energy policy failure. Report by Abby Garton-Crosby. The Tories' attempt to blame the Scottish Government for Westminster's failure to secure new offshore wind farms at a key auction was branded embarrassing. Douglas Lumsden, Scottish Tory MSP for North East Scotland region, claimed that the UK Government's failure to secure any bids for offshore wind contracts last week should be a wake-up call for the Scottish Government. The MSP claimed that it should be a warning against ministers putting all their eggs in one basket, and urged the First Minister to look again at having a more balanced energy mix that includes nuclear. Deputy First Minister Shona Robison could be heard saying Lumsden's contribution was embarrassing during First Minister's questions on Thursday. We told how Westminster's inaction over the soaring costs of offshore wind projects led to criticism from the SNP, who said it was putting Scotland's renewable and economic future at risk. Wind farm builders had warned for months that the UK Government, which sets a maximum price that companies are allowed to charge, was not taking into account how much costs had been soared during the cost of living crisis. In response to Lumsden's question, the First Minister said that he rightly looks embarrassed. That the Scottish Government is somehow responsible for the failure of the contract for the Spirit auction that the UK Government controlled, it is seriously desperate from the member, the FM said. If he doesn't want to listen to me, he's to listen to the likes of Keith Anderson, who said, and I'll quote directly, This is a multi-billion-pound lost opportunity to deliver low-cost energy for consumers and a wake-up call for the UK national government. It came after SNP MSP Emma Harper raised the auction fee earlier in the session, with the First Minister stating that the incident exposes the UK government's complete failure to capture one of the greatest opportunities for Scotland's net zero economy. He accused the Westminster Tories of being both anti-climate and anti-growth, adding that the Scottish Government backs calls from industry to increase the strike price. Offshore wind contracts are seen as the backbone of the UK's green electricity ambitions, but the lack of any successful projects at this auction was branded the biggest disaster for clean energy in almost a decade by Greenpeace. Elsewhere, Scottish Tory leader Douglas Ross led his questioning on body-worn cameras for police officers, and warnings that they won't be rolled out until next year. The First Minister said the Scottish Government had increased the budget for the force, and pointed to comments made by Deputy Chief Officer David Page, who said that plans to roll out body-worn cameras were in line with previous planning. And Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar led on a number of patients in Scotland who were seeking private treatment due to NHS waiting times. He asked if the First Minister thought it was acceptable that 5,000 patients last year were forced to cover the cost of their hip or knee replacements. Yousaf said that Sarwar had once again neglected to mention the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and pointed to waiting time figures in Labour-run Wales, noting that it would be cold comfort for those on waiting lists. After Sarwar claimed that more and more Scots have been forced to pay the price for SNP incompetence and failure, the First Minister hit back and claimed there was an increasing activity in the NHS. On the cost of living crisis, Yousaf said the Scottish Government was taking action to tackle the issue, with an estimated 90,000 children lifted out of poverty, in stark contrast to Sarwar's summer of U-turns. Where he has aligned himself with cruel Tory policy after cruel Tory policy, now we are unashamedly anti-poverty, unashamedly pro-growth. The only thing Anna Sarwar is pro-Starmer. Later, Scottish Labour MSP Sarah Boyack was met with laughter by MSPs after she accused the Scottish Government of flip-flopping on oil and gas. Yousaf said that Boyack would have more credibility if our party hadn't U-turned on its support for low emission zones or dropped its £28 billion Green Prosperity Fund. And that is the very, very point here, that time and time again, his Scottish Government doesn't just talk the talk, we are prepared to walk the walk. He said, "We will bring forward serious action to tackle climate emergency, but what would really help is that those parties that demand we meet our targets don't then oppose every single measure we bring to this chamber." And that report was by Abby Garton Crosby. From the National, Thursday the 14th of September, from the Politics section. See the SNP's key independence motion ahead of conference. Article by James Walker. The SNP have set out their key independence motion ahead of the forthcoming annual party conference. Signed by First Minister Humza Yousaf and seconded by SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn, the motion, to be debated by party members next month, sets out the party's independence strategy going into the next UK general election. Just as Yousaf set out at a special conference in June this year, the motion states that negotiations for independence are to take place if the SNP win the most seats rather than votes in Scotland at the next general election. The motion also outlines next steps, including publishing a document, withdrawal from Westminster, a new partnership agreement, which would set out in detailed terms the SNP would seek discussions with the UK government. The document would also include draft legal text on the transfer of powers from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament necessary to prepare for independence. The motion also puts forward that a nationwide consultation on a draft interim constitution should be conducted, which would then be founding document of an independent Scotland. Finally, it suggests establishing an EU envoy position in Brussels. Taken up by a representative of the Scottish Government, they would prepare the ground for Scotland to become an independent member state of the EU. The full motion was drafted following a series of 8 regional assemblies over the summer and is to be considered by members in advance of the annual conference in October. It reads, Conference believes that the next UK general election should be used as an opportunity to advance the cause of independence and to demonstrate how the powers of independence would enable us to take action on Scotland's priorities, from tackling the Westminster-made cost of living crisis, to protecting our public services, eradicating poverty, and building a fairer economy that works for us all. Conference believes that Scotland is facing a cost of Westminster crisis, one that is making life increasingly challenging for people across the country, and makes the case for independence even more urgent. Conference notes that the UK government continues to unjustly block a democratic referendum, thereby denying the people of Scotland the opportunity to express their support for independence. Conference therefore supports using the next UK general election as a means to offer that opportunity and advance the cause of Scotland's independence, and further notes that this approach has been debated at regional assemblies across Scotland, with widespread support as a means to move Scotland forward to achieving independence. Conference agrees that the SNP manifesto for the UK general election should state on page 1, line 1, the following simple and powerful statement: Vote SNP for Scotland to become an independent country. Conference further agrees that the SNP manifesto and campaign should highlight the direct link between Westminster rule and the many challenges that we are facing as a country, and demonstrate the opportunities of independence across the board on the issues that matter most to the people of Scotland. Conference believes that if the SNP subsequently wins the most seats at the general election in Scotland, the Scottish Government is empowered to bring immediate negotiations with the UK Government to give democratic effect to Scotland becoming an independent country, and to take the following actions as part of preparations for Scotland's independence. Publish withdrawal from Westminster, a new partnership agreement, which would set out the detailed terms we would seek in discussions with the UK Government for Scotland becoming an independent country, and include draft legal text on the transfer of powers from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament necessary to prepare for independence. Conduct a nationwide consultation on a draft interim constitution, which would be the founding document of an independent Scotland. Prepare the ground for Scotland to become an independent member of the state of the EU by establishing an envoy position who would be a representative of the Scottish Government in Brussels. To note, the resolution is open to amendments, although they must be submitted by 9 AM on September the 27th. And that article was by James Walker. From the National, Thursday the 14th of September. From the news section, SNP slammed Suella Braverman tweet and call for urgent apology. Report by James Walker. The SNP have slammed Suella Braverman for an abhorrent tweet in which she talked about migrants and have called for an urgent apology. Writing in The Sun on Wednesday, Keir Starmer laid out his plans to stop small boat crossings and send those who arrive illegally back to the EU. But it appears as though the Home Secretary wasn't impressed, saying the plans would make the UK a dumping ground for migrants. She tweeted, "Finally we see Sir Keir Starmer's migration plan. He'll let Brussels decide who comes to the UK. He'll agree to make Britain the dumping ground for many of the millions of illegal migrants that Europe doesn't want, and none of this will stop the boats." Braverman's tweet and Starmer's plans were swiftly condemned by the First Minister Humza Yousaf, who said, "Just woeful. The data tells us that migration is good for this country and is needed to help with our labour shortages. Migrants also contribute to our culture, academia, public service and in many other ways. What a pathetically insular country the UK has become." Now, the SNP are demanding an apology for Braverman's dumping ground comments. The party's Justice and Immigration spokesperson, Chris Stevens, said, "The Home Secretary's appalling language warrants an urgent apology. It is truly abhorrent that she thinks it is acceptable to refer to refugees and asylum seekers with such disdain. Such language makes a mockery of compassionate conservatism and, in years gone by, would have been met for calls for the Home Secretary's resignation. Now, though, it seems Suella Braverman can break the ministerial code and have her colleagues admit she's unfit for office and still keep her role in the cabinet. While Scotland welcomes refugees and asylum seekers, Westminster becomes ever more insular and inhumane. It is only with the full powers of independence can Scotland offer refugees a fair and dignified system which allows them the opportunity to support to rebuild their lives. And that report was by James Walker. From the National, Thursday the 14th of September, from the news section, Tories attack Humza Yousaf for smirking as national anthem booed. Article by the Joker. The Tories are desperate to win back some of their voters and save their plummeting approval ratings. That's apparent from their confected fury over every little thing Humza Yousaf and the Scottish Government do. If they're not blaming Holyrood for the UK Government's policy failures, they're apparently examining footage of Scottish ministers for a hint of personality which could be used against them. In their latest headline-grabbing outburst, the Tories are accusing the First Minister of smirking as Scotland fans booed God Save the King at their Hampden friendly against England this week. Footage of the fans drowning out the national anthem went viral and provoked quite a bit of debate. Some say it's petty, others say it's harmless sporting rivalry. If you're the Tory MSP Finlay Carson, it's disgraceful, and the team at the National should be ashamed of ourselves for daring to even share the footage on our social feeds. Disgraceful. Why would you want to promote and highlight the shameful booing of any national anthem is beyond me, he told us on Tuesday night. It's called reporting, Mr. Carson. Just because you're not a fan of it doesn't mean newspapers won't point out that it happened. Anyway, now the Scottish Sun have obtained footage of Yousaf at the match, and their source claimed the SNP chief appeared to be smirking as the booing situation unfolded. It looked like he was desperate to let out a big guffaw and was trying to conceal it, the person claimed. Then Murdo Fraser stepped in to make sure the FM got a really good and proper telling off for the disgraceful scenes. We can't have smiling in public now. Humza Yousaf has made no secret of the fact that he's a Republican, but, as First Minister of Scotland, he has a duty to show respect to our head of state and all nations and anthems, the Tory MSP told the newspaper. By apparently smirking while a section of supporters booed God Save the King, he fell short of that. The FM spokesperson wasn't having any of it though. This is a massive over-interpretation by the Conservatives, they said. They ought to have more important things on their mind. The First Minister was looking forward to the match. End of story. And that article was by the Joker.
That concludes this week's edition of the National Podcast. Please remember to subscribe to our channels at Tune Review and tell your friends about our service.